Just one submarine with 16 of these Polaris intercontinental missiles can deliver the equivalent of all the explosives of World War II. The ballistic missile submarine is the heart of our strategic nuclear deterrent. Yesterday's deterrent was the battleship. So the ballistic missile submarine has a claim indeed to be the capital ship of today and of the future. But the huge ballistic missile firing submarine has really little to do with the sea power story. A virtually invulnerable launching platform for nuclear weapons, but well outside the mainstream of truly naval affairs. But there is no doubt that this brand new ship, HMS Spartan, is the absolute embodiment of sea power today. This kind of submarine has a much better claim to be the capital ship of the Navy, an attack submarine like HMS Spartan, quite different from her half-sister, the Polaris submarine, though she's also driven by a nuclear reactor. But her weapon is the new generation torpedo. Although the idea is very old, the first working submarine was conceived as a secret weapon for the Irish rebels of that time. But in 1900, John Philip Holland sold his invention to the American government, and the Holland boat was built in Britain too. This primitive craft was to be the first of hundreds and then thousands of submarines over the next half-century. Those early submarines were submersible torpedo boats, the ideal weapon of the weaker naval power, cheap and deadly. In the beginning, the submarine was just for coastal defense against an invading fleet or blockade, like the earlier torpedo boat. The submarine would lie off the coast unseen, waiting until some great battleship came within range. She'd loose off her torpedoes without warning and slip away unnoticed. In those days, there was no way of detecting submarines. ASDIC or sonar hadn't been invented. The chief offensive weapon of those days was the battleship with its big guns. This was the age of the battle fleet. All other naval vessels were there to support it. The Navy began to think the place for the submarine was with the fleet, even to do the jobs that surface ships did. So the submarine had to be big enough and fast enough to keep up with the battleships and cruisers and destroyers, to be a flotilla of submersible torpedo boats in support of the battleships. The K-class submarines actually had steam turbines for high speed on the surface. But to dive, the fires had to be put out, the head of steam got rid of, the funnels had to come down, the air intakes had to be closed. It took 20 minutes, the slowest crash dive ever. It's more like 20 seconds today. There was even a cargo submarine, the Deutschland. In World War I, she made 2 runs to neutral America, breaking the British blockade. The battleship submarine, with just one huge 12-inch gun, useless and never tried in war. Another experiment was even stranger.
We are here. I want you to search for shipping in this direction. Ivan.
The aircraft-carrying submarine seemed a good idea at the time, but it didn't last long. And then the cruiser submarine. She was very big. She mounted cruiser-sized guns in turrets. She soon went to the breaker's yard. The French Navy tried to go one better. Surcouf had 2 8-inch guns and a seaplane. The Americans built 9 of these submersible cruisers. After all those attempts to turn a submarine into an imitation surface warship, they realized it couldn't be done. But this is more like it. This is one of the last batch of conventional submarines built for the Royal Navy. Like virtually every submarine before her, she's driven by diesel engines when on the surface. Underwater, she's powered by huge electric batteries. She doesn't have the speed or the unlimited endurance of the nuclear boat. She can't dive so deep, and she has to surface to breathe, or do it through a tube called the snort. She's very, very much cheaper than a nuclear submarine, and has the edge in shallow water. Although this one is twice the displacement of most World War II submarines, she's recognizable as a true descendant, even of that first Holland boat. It was craft basically like this that caused so much havoc in 2 world wars and brought Britain uncomfortably close to defeat in both of them. In spite of the mighty and undefeated British battle fleet, it seemed the Royal Navy could do nothing to prevent the daily sinking of ships loaded with food and munitions for the Western Front. Nothing until the ships were sailed in convoy. Unrestricted submarine warfare caused an outcry. Between the wars, Britain, with a large navy and a huge merchant marine, more than once proposed the complete abolition of the submarine as a weapon of war. In World War II, history seemed likely to repeat itself. Although Germany hadn't planned another U-boat war, her submarines were dramatically successful. This time, the Germans had an answer to the convoy, the Wolf Pack. When a convoy was spotted, it was shadowed. Its course and speed radioed back to Berlin. Grand Admiral Dönitz would call up all U-boats which could reach the convoy. They'd attack individually, at night, on the surface. In 1943, more than halfway through the war, U-boats were sinking merchantmen faster than they could be built. By now, Germany had wholeheartedly adopted the U-boat as her chief weapon against the Allies. Britain and America fought back with more escorting warships, improved ASDIC and radar, new weapons, and above all, aircraft. Even so, the Battle of the Atlantic was a damn close-run thing. But the British submarine service, in boats very like this one, couldn't choose where to fight. They had to go where the enemy were, and that was mainly in the Mediterranean. There was no obvious target, because there were very few German merchant ships. Even so, in the Mediterranean, the Royal Navy's submarines successfully disrupted the supply routes to Rommel's Africa Corps. But the narrow waters between Italy and North Africa were very difficult for submarine warfare. The Axis convoys were heavily defended. The convoy routes were short and easily covered by air patrols. Of the 82 British submarines lost in World War II, most were sunk in the Mediterranean. On the other side of the world, between the wars, neither the Americans nor the Japanese had properly understood submarine warfare. In both navies, the submarine was expected to work with the fleet and attack enemy warships. But after Pearl Harbor, the American Navy at once resorted to unrestricted submarine warfare. They realized they were now the weaker naval power, especially in the Western Pacific and in Japanese home waters. They understood the submarine was at its deadliest against merchant shipping, so long as they disregarded international law.
Up scope.
By the end of the war, the Japanese merchant marine was almost completely destroyed. Japan was blockaded, cut off from her sources of fuel and war material. It was the Battle of the Atlantic in reverse, and they lost. It was a brilliant campaign, and in spite of the American Navy making films like this, it remains one of the least known victories in the history of sea warfare, a major factor in the defeat of Japan. Although the submarine has been with us for almost a century, the true submarine is still very new. Until nuclear power went to sea, all previous submarines were really no more than submersible torpedo boats. The amount of time they can spend underwater is limited. They're relatively slow, both submerged and on the surface. They have to surface regularly, or use their snort to run the diesel engines so as to charge the batteries and to replenish the air for the crew to breathe. In a nuclear attack boat like this, all those problems have been solved. They're a different breed. This true submarine has a nuclear power plant that can run for many years without refueling. There's ample power to clean and regenerate new air from the surrounding water indefinitely. The only limit to the time this submarine can remain underwater is determined by the endurance of her crew. So these nuclear submarines have caused a real revolution in naval warfare. The torpedo has undergone a revolution too. It's a highly sophisticated guided missile. Launched underwater, flies in air, and homes onto its target. Much deadlier than just a torpedo. The submarine is no longer the weapon of the weaker power. Quite the reverse. The destroyer idea has really been the most consistent one in maritime strategy, certainly during the half-century during which I've served in the Royal Navy. In the very beginning, it was the torpedo boat destroyer, soon to be called just destroyer. Her job was to hunt and kill the torpedo boats that threatened our fleet, and in particular, our battleships. A victorious battle fleet was the guarantee of naval supremacy, or that's how it seemed in those far-off days. But the battleship had her Achilles heel. She couldn't be completely protected below the waterline. She was vulnerable to the mine and the torpedo. And although the early torpedo was a primitive weapon with a very short range, it could now be delivered by a very small, fast-moving, and extremely cheap launching platform, the torpedo boat. St. Istvan, a battleship of the Austrian Navy, was sunk in the Adriatic in 1918 by motor torpedo boats. Of her ship's company, 1,300 went down with her. The Admiral's nightmare had become reality. To counteract the torpedo boat threat, a special kind of warship had been developed, the torpedo boat destroyer. Just as fast as the torpedo boat, but larger and therefore steadier, a better sea boat in rough weather. Her guns were big enough to destroy the torpedo boats long before they could get in close enough. And because the destroyer also mounted torpedo tubes, it wasn't very long before she became in her turn a larger and more powerful version of the torpedo boat. And so began what you might call the golden age of the destroyer. Those old destroyers were beautiful ships. Perhaps because they were descended from torpedo boats, they were always known in the Navy as the boats. I can remember as a young officer in the 1930s, the British Mediterranean fleet had 5 destroyer flotillas. Each flotilla was 8 boats and a leader, 45 destroyers. The Royal Navy in those days had altogether about 200 destroyers and escort vessels. Today, we've got 13 destroyers and 53 frigates, but they're a very different breed, and each of them costs about 50 times as much to build as their predecessors did. Destroyers were the light cavalry of the fleet. They were invented to protect the big ships, but they soon took on an offensive role of their own, to seek out the enemy wherever he might be and destroy him. They attracted a special breed of naval officer. In those days, the captain of a destroyer had almost certainly been a first lieutenant, the Jimmy, and number 2, and the sub, all the time in destroyers. Destroyer men didn't hold with big ships like battleships or even cruisers. They thought they were stuffy and dull. They were cramped and uncomfortable in their little ships, but they liked it in the boats. For them, this was the only life. Destroyer captains were above all daring. Their seamanship certainly matched the really splendid ships they commanded. They weren't technical specialists, but they prided themselves on their readiness to do anything that was asked of them. The fleet destroyer tactics were very simple. The entire flotilla, 8 boats plus the leader, would steam at full speed towards the enemy line of battle under cover of a thick smoke screen, if the wind was right. No radar in those days. They had to get well inside the effective range of the torpedoes, 2 miles or less, to give them a chance. Then each ship, in succession, would fire all her torpedoes as she turned away. Say 8 torpedoes in a fan-shaped spread. 72 torpedoes couldn't all miss. And if enemy destroyers tried to stop them, well, the quick-firing 4-inch or 4.7 guns were there to deal with that sort of opposition. This maritime cavalry charge was a method practiced for half a century. She was truly the most useful, the most versatile fighting ship of them all. But her main task was still to be the fleet destroyer, to seek out the enemy and fight him with torpedo and gun, and to screen the battle fleet from torpedo attack. But now, that attack was coming from a new sort of torpedo boat that could hide underwater. The submarine. At first, the destroyers had no way of locating an enemy submarine. ASDIC or sonar came too late for World War I. Once a submarine had dived below periscope depth, you could only hope to drop high explosives on the place where you guessed she might be. But you needed a good turn of speed to get there in time, and to get clear of your own depth charges. So, from now on, destroyers became submarine destroyers. From World War II, every destroyer was equipped to locate and destroy submarines. But the big fleet destroyer could do many other things. She was very fast, very powerful, and even too heavily armed for the most common task, convoy escort. The need then was for several hundreds of smaller, cheaper, simple escort vessels. Of all His Majesty's ships during the war, none inspired greater affection than the Flower-class corvette. This sturdy little ship was designed for mass production. The Flowers were built very quickly, nearly 300 of them. They weren't very fast, they weren't well armed. But for almost the entire war, ships with names like Anemone and Bluebell, Clematis and Delphinium bore the brunt of the maritime war in the Atlantic. Life on board a corvette was exhausting. On watch, as well as between decks, the sailors were always wet, always cold, always uncomfortable.
As anyone who served in destroyers or escort vessels in wartime knows, you were permanently on the job. You'd come in from a patrol or a convoy, refuel, top up with ammunition, and expect to be at sea again within a matter of hours. There were never enough destroyers and escort vessels.
The Atlantic Ocean was a bridge. Across that bridge came a stream of troops and tanks and guns, weapons, ammunition of all kinds, food and oil, raw materials for industry. If we'd failed to keep that bridge open, the war could never have been won. There'd have been no D-Day, no liberation of occupied Europe. By 1943, Hitler's wolf packs were sinking merchantmen faster than they could be built. That bridge over the Atlantic was very nearly smashed. The only sure answer to the U-boat or the surface radar was to sail the merchant ships in escorted convoy. The convoy wasn't just a means of passive defense. It was offensive too. To sink the merchantmen, the U-boats would have to fight their way through the destroyers. We realized, all of us, that although this was quite unlike the Battle of Jutland, we were just the same, fighting a fleet action on the grand scale, every day of the week, for nearly 6 years, and our country's survival depended on winning it.
There was a phrase much used in those days, which is as true today as it was then. It accurately summed up what sea power was all about, the safe and timely arrival of the convoy.
Above all, the Battle of the Atlantic demanded hundreds of destroyers and corvettes and frigates and new techniques to destroy the U-boats underwater. The first depth charges had simply been rolled over the stern. Quite soon, they were also fired from mortars. But there was little certainty of destroying a U-boat because she was in the destroyer's blind spot. ASDIC could only search forward. The destruction of U-boats had to become much more scientific. The breakthrough came when depth charges could be thrown forward. more than a generation has passed. Hardly anyone now serving afloat took part in that heroic series of battles. Yet the chief task of the Royal Navy today is still, as it was in those days, to protect Allied shipping in the Atlantic Ocean. This fast, modern frigate has inherited the task of the destroyer of 35 or 40 years ago, finding and sinking enemy submarines, and not the old-fashioned diesel-engine submersibles of 2 world wars, but the true submarine, nuclear-powered, a much more dangerous enemy. When I joined the Navy, anti-submarine warfare was the poor relation, the Cinderella. But ever since the last war, a really colossal effort has been put into the business of hunting and killing submarines.
Center bearing 010. Range 1800.
Tacker contact 010.
Range in.
1800. Range in.
Bearing in. Rate 8 in.
Rate 8 in. Range rate closing 8. Make a pitch mud high. Classified submarine.
Make your opening heading 310. Roger, my heading 310, ready for attack.
Submarine course 115.
Mark drop. Now.
The frigate isn't simply a rather expensive helicopter pad. She's a mobile platform for batteries of missiles and homing torpedoes. She's also a floating command post. And, most important, she's packed with electronic devices. She fights an electronic war. No longer do naval experts just count the guns of a man-of-war. Instead, they look carefully at the ship's mast. The more radar aerials and antennae, the more powerful the ship. The electronic revolution goes far to explain why modern destroyers or frigates look so different. 100 years ago, the steel battleship had emerged as the embodiment of maritime power. Her guns and her armor plate made her supreme. But she was challenged at once by the tiny torpedo boats, and then by the submarine, and then by the aircraft. The destroyer dealt with them all. Yesterday's torpedo is today's guided missile. Just like yesterday, it can be launched by small craft, and they're cheap. Whatever launches it still has to be destroyed. So 100 years may have changed the means of naval warfare. But sea power hasn't changed, nor the influence of it on world events.
Many years ago, the Tsar of Russia said, every ruler who has a land army has only one hand, but he who has a fleet has both hands. My brother admirals believed that 100 years ago, and 50 years ago, and I believe it today, and so do the Russians. We shall forget it at our peril.